I came to the bank to get a $2,000 loan, but the manager stopped me. "Ma'am, look at your balance." It was $44 million. I thought it was a mistake. I had never had that kind of money. "Ma'am, this is not a mistake. The sender—" Good day, dear listeners. It's Maria again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for most of my adult life, I believed that $2,000 was a lot of money. Not in some philosophical, grateful for small things way. I mean that literally. $2,000 was the difference between a functional life and a crisis. It was the number I calculated in my head every time the washing machine made that grinding noise. Every time my daughter Lily mentioned that her school's spring trip to Washington, D.C. cost $340. Every time I drove past a gas station and decided I could make it another day on fumes. $2,000 was the ceiling of my ambitions in any given month. I was 44 years old, a fourth-grade teacher at Riverside Elementary in Columbus, Ohio. I'd been teaching for 16 years. I loved my job. I want to be clear about that. But loving your job does not pay off a water heater that dies in January, or cover the gap when your car insurance goes up without warning, or replace the section of kitchen ceiling that had been slowly yellowing from a slow leak in the upstairs bathroom for 2 years. I had been meaning to fix that ceiling for 8 months. I had the estimate, $1,850. A plumber, a plasterer, a can of paint. Simple. The problem was that after rent, utilities, groceries, Lily's school costs, and the minimum payment on the credit card I'd been carrying since my divorce 6 years ago, there was very little left over. Not nothing. I was careful, methodical, proud of how I managed, but very little. My savings account held $412. My checking account had $877. These were not shameful numbers. I had built them intentionally, the way you stack sandbags before a flood, but they were not $1,850. Lily was 16 then. She was tall like her father, thoughtful like me, and already asking questions about college that I answered with as much confidence as I could manufacture. She deserved to not worry about money. I worked hard to make sure she didn't have to. Whether I succeeded at that is something only she can say. But I tried. God, I tried. That Tuesday morning in February, I dropped Lily at school, drove to the First National Bank branch on Henderson Road, and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going inside. I had rehearsed what I was going to say. I had my pay stubs in a manila folder. I had a printout of the estimate from the contractor. I had calculated my debt-to-income ratio the night before using a template I found online. I was prepared. I was a little embarrassed, the way you always are when you have to ask for help, but I was prepared. The branch was quiet at 8:45 in the morning. 2 tellers behind the counter, both young enough to be my students' older siblings. A woman at a desk in the corner who looked up when I walked in and smiled the automatic smile of someone trained to smile. I told her I was interested in applying for a personal loan. She said her name was Deanna, and she led me to a chair across from her desk and offered me coffee, which I declined because I was already nervous enough. The application took about 15 minutes. Deanna was professional and kind. She asked me about my income, my employment history, my existing debts. She typed steadily. At some point, she pulled up my account. I had been a customer of this bank for 11 years, and I watched her face change. It was a subtle shift, the kind of change you might miss if you weren't looking directly at a person's eyes. Her fingers stopped moving on the keyboard. She looked at the screen, then back at me, then at the screen again. She pressed her lips together. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, and then corrected herself. "Ms. Mitchell." I'm sorry, just give me one moment. She got up and walked to the back, which I found strange. I sat in the chair and looked at the framed poster on the wall behind her desk. Your future starts here. A stock photo of a family on a sailboat, everyone tan and laughing. Deanna came back with a man I recognized as the branch manager, Greg something. I had dealt with him once before when there was an error in my statement. He was carrying a printed sheet of paper, folded in half. He sat down in Deanna's chair and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Careful, almost cautious. Ms. Mitchell, he said, before we proceed with the loan application, I need you to look at something. He unfolded the paper and turned it toward me. It was a printout of my account summary. I looked at the number. I looked at it again. The balance field read $44,127,493.18. I laughed. It was an involuntary sound, short and bewildered, the kind of laugh that has nothing to do with humor. That's obviously a mistake, I said. Greg, his last name was Harmon, I remembered then, shook his head slowly. Ms. Mitchell, it's not a mistake. The transfer came in 4 days ago. It cleared this morning. He paused, and the words that followed changed every single thing about my life. The sender listed on the wire transfer is the estate of Edward Collins. My father's name. The father I hadn't spoken to in 11 years. The father I didn't know was dead. Edward Collins. I sat in that chair and said nothing for what felt like a full minute. Greg Harmon was patient. Deanna had gone back to her desk, though I could feel her awareness of me, the practiced discretion of someone trained not to stare at other people's shock. My father, the estate of Edward Collins. The estate. That word alone told me what I wasn't ready to accept. You don't have an estate until you're dead. When? I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. The wire originated from a law firm, Greg said, sliding the paper slightly closer to me. Whitmore and Associates, out of Scottsdale, Arizona. The transfer was initiated 6 days ago. Beyond that, I don't have information about the timeline. You'd need to contact the firm directly. Scottsdale. My father had moved to Arizona 11 years ago, the same year everything between us fell apart. The same year he married Gloria. I picked up the paper. The routing number, the account number, the figure with its 8 digits, and its decimal point sitting there in plain black ink. $44,127,493.18. I had never seen a number that large outside of news articles about government budgets. Is there somewhere private I can sit? I asked. Greg stood immediately. Of course. Follow me. He took me to a small conference room, a glass table, 4 chairs, a water pitcher nobody had refilled, a window that looked out onto the parking lot. He left me alone, which I was grateful for. I sat down, put the paper on the table, and called my daughter's school to let them know I would be late for pickup. Then I stared at the parking lot for a while. My father and I had not spoken since November of 2013. The silence had not been dramatic, no single screaming fight, no door slammed hard enough to shake the frame. It had been quieter than that, and therefore harder to fix. After my mother died, my father had grieved in a way that left no room for me. He had met Gloria within 8 months. He had married her 14 months after my mother's funeral. I had tried. I want to say that clearly, I had tried. But Gloria had made her position evident from the beginning, and my father had chosen his peace over his daughter, one small choice at a time, until the distance between us became a geography I didn't know how to cross anymore. I had sent him a card when Lily was born. He had sent a gift card, a $50 Visa gift card, the kind you buy at a drugstore, with a note in Gloria's handwriting. After that, I stopped trying. He had been 71 years old last I knew. He had been healthy, as far as I was aware, though I was not aware of much, and now he was dead, and I had not been told. 6 weeks. That was what the manager had implied. The transfer had come through recently, which meant the estate had been in process for weeks, maybe longer. My father had been buried somewhere in Arizona, and no one had picked up a phone. Who doesn't tell a man's daughter that he died? I knew the answer. I had known it the moment Greg said the word Arizona. I drove home from the bank in a state I can only describe as pressurized calm, the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from the overwhelming volume of things happening inside you all at once. I cried at a red light on Morse Road, 2 minutes, and then it stopped, as if my body had allocated exactly that much. Then I was just driving. At home, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and searched for Whitmore and Associates, Scottsdale, Arizona. The firm's website came up immediately. Estate planning, probate, asset management, a phone number. I looked at the clock. 11:14 a.m. Arizona was 2 hours behind. Too early to call? No. I called. A receptionist answered. I gave my name. I said I was calling regarding the estate of Edward Collins and that I believed I was a beneficiary. There was a pause, a brief hold, and then a man came on the line. His name was James Whitmore. His voice was careful, the voice of a man who had delivered difficult information before and had learned to do it without stumbling. He confirmed that my father, Edward Raymond Collins, had passed away 8 weeks ago. A cardiac event. Quiet, at home, in the early morning. He expressed condolences that sounded genuine. He told me that he had been attempting to contact me for 6 weeks through an address on file that turned out to be outdated. He said the situation had been, and here he chose his word deliberately, complicated. Complicated how? I asked. Ms. Mitchell, your father updated his will approximately 3 months before his death, significantly updated it. The original document named his wife, Gloria Collins, as sole beneficiary of the estate. The amended version names you as primary beneficiary of the liquid assets, which total approximately $44 million, and retains a residential property for Mrs. Collins's use during her lifetime. The silence that followed was enormous. Does Gloria know about the amendment? I asked. Another careful pause. She was informed at the reading of the will, yes, 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. Gloria had known for 3 weeks that my father had changed his will. She had said nothing to me. No call, no letter, no notification through the attorney. Nothing. And why would she? Because if I didn't know, and the funds stayed unclaimed long enough, who knew what could be contested, delayed, or redirected? I hung up the call and sat very still. My father had left me $44 million. He had done it quietly, without telling me, without explaining, without giving me the chance to ask why. Gloria had been at the reading. Gloria had known. And in 3 weeks, she had not once reached out to the daughter her husband had chosen over her. What does a person do when they realize they've been deliberately kept in the dark? I opened a new tab and searched for estate litigation attorneys in Columbus, Ohio. That was the moment I stopped being afraid and started being strategic. Mark Harris came recommended by a colleague at school whose brother had gone through an ugly divorce. He's not cheap, she told me, but he's sharp and he doesn't flinch. I needed someone who didn't flinch. His office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, which felt significant to me at the time. I had never hired a professional who worked above the third floor of anything. His handshake was firm without being performative. He was 50-something, gray at the temples, with reading glasses he pushed up onto his forehead when he wasn't using them. He listened to me for 20 minutes without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be. When I finished, he uncapped his pen. "First question," he said. "Have you touched the money?" "No, it's sitting in my account. I haven't moved it, deposited anything into it, or withdrawn from it." "Good. Don't. Not yet." He wrote something. "Second question. Do you have any documentation of the estrangement? Letters, emails, anything that establishes the nature of your relationship with your father and with Mrs. Collins?" I had kept everything. I don't know why. I am not a sentimental person by nature, but I had kept the emails my father had sent in the first 2 years of the estrangement, when we were still trying to maintain something. I had kept the one certified letter I'd received from a Scottsdale family attorney in 2016, telling me, on Gloria's behalf, that my father wished to have no further contact. I had kept that letter because it had seemed important to keep, a document of what had been done to me. "I have quite a bit," I said. Mark Harris nodded slowly. "Then we're in a strong position. What we need now is the amended will itself, a certified copy, and the medical records from your father's final 6 months. If Mrs. Collins intends to challenge the amendment, she'll argue he lacked capacity. We need to get ahead of that." He filed the initial paperwork that week. As his client, I was entitled to a certified copy of the will through the probate court in Maricopa County, Arizona. He also sent a formal notice of representation to Whitmore and Associates, informing them that I had retained counsel and that all communications regarding the estate should go through his office. That notice, I later understood, was the thing that set everything in motion. It had been 9 days since the bank. I had told no one except Mark and my best friend Kim, who had sat across from me at her kitchen table with a glass of wine she kept refilling and said several times, in slightly different ways, "Sarah, $44 million. I had asked her to keep it quiet, and she had, because Kim is one of those people who actually does what she says she'll do. Lily didn't know. I was not ready to explain to my 16-year-old daughter that her grandfather, a man she had met twice in her life, both times before she was 7, had died and left us more money than we could spend in 10 lifetimes. I needed to understand what was real before I could explain it to someone else. The certified copy of the will arrived on a Thursday afternoon via overnight courier. I signed for it at my front door in my teaching clothes, still wearing the lanyard with my school ID. I carried it to the kitchen table and read it standing up because I couldn't make myself sit down. The original will, executed in 2009, left everything to Gloria Ann Collins. The amendment, dated August 14th, 3 months and 4 days before my father's death, had been notarized by a licensed notary in Scottsdale and witnessed by 2 individuals unconnected to either Gloria or the law firm. It was clean. It was explicit. It named me, Sarah Lynn Mitchell, née Collins, as the primary beneficiary of all liquid assets held in my father's name, including investment accounts, savings, and cash holdings. The language was careful and deliberate. There was a handwritten addendum, not legally binding, Mark told me later, but profoundly significant. In my father's handwriting, which I recognized from Christmas cards of 15 years ago, Sarah, I am sorry I waited so long. I know this cannot fix what was lost, but it is what I have left to give. Dade. I stood in my kitchen and read those words 4 times. Then I put the document back in its envelope, set it on the counter, and washed my hands at the sink for no reason I could explain. Outside my kitchen window, a neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard. Somewhere down the street, a car alarm went off and then stopped. What I did not know, could not have known yet, was that 40 miles across the city, a phone call was taking place. Gloria had received the notice from Mark's office that same morning. I learned the details of that call only months later, during the court proceedings, when her phone records were subpoenaed. She'd called her son Brent within minutes of the notification arriving. Brent Collins, her son from a first marriage, not my father's biological child, but a man who had lived in my father's house for 7 years and who stood to inherit quite a lot under the original will, had driven from his apartment in Dublin, Ohio, where he had lived since moving there 2 years ago, to his mother's hotel in Arizona, where she was managing the estate, within 24 hours of that call. They knew I was moving, and knowing that, they began to move too. I had my evidence. I had my attorney. I had my father's apology in his own handwriting on the back page of a legal document. There was no going back from this. Not for me, and not for them. Mark's instruction about the money was clear. Move it to an account with restricted access, opened specifically to hold estate funds while the legal process unfolded. Not a regular checking account, not anything connected to my daily banking. A separate financial institution, a separate structure, with a hold placed so that no withdrawal above a threshold could be made without his office's co-signature. It's a protection, he explained, not a restriction. It tells any court that you are treating this money responsibly, not recklessly. That matters. I set up the account on a Friday afternoon with a financial institution his office worked with regularly. The transfer took less than 10 minutes to initiate and 72 hours to clear. When it did, the $44,127,493.18 moved out of First National and into something that felt, for the first time, genuinely secure. I didn't feel richer. I felt safer. Those are not the same thing. I didn't tell anyone at work. I went to school on Monday morning, taught my fourth graders about fractions and the water cycle, ate lunch in the faculty room with the same people I always ate lunch with, and drove home at 4 o'clock through the same traffic on the same roads. My ceiling in the kitchen was still yellowed. The contractor had come for a final estimate 2 weeks ago, and his invoice was still sitting on my counter. I hadn't scheduled the work yet. Somehow it seemed important to wait, to not change anything visible until I understood what was coming. What was coming arrived on a Wednesday evening, 11 days after the will copy. I was making dinner, pasta, a jar of sauce, a salad I'd thrown together from what was in the refrigerator, when the doorbell rang. Lily was upstairs doing homework. I wiped my hands and went to the door. Brent Collins was standing on my porch. I had met him twice in my life. Once at my father and Gloria's wedding, where he had been 23 and had barely looked at me. Once at a family gathering 3 years later that I had attended out of misplaced hope, where he had been courteous in the way that people are courteous to someone they consider beneath consideration. He was 41 now, taller than I remembered, heavier, with my father's house in his eyes. The specific entitlement of someone who had lived for years in a wealthy household and had come to believe that wealth was a personal quality rather than a circumstance. Gloria was behind him. She was 66, slim in an effortful way, wearing clothes that were expensive without being ostentatious. Her hair was the same silver blonde it had always been. She was looking at my house with an expression I recognized. The survey, the inventory, the calculation. She had always been a woman who assessed rooms. "Sarah," Brent said. Not a greeting, a statement. "This isn't a good time," I said. I didn't open the door fully. I kept my hand on the frame. "We need to talk about the estate." His voice was controlled, prepared. My mother has driven a long way. Everything regarding the estate goes through my attorney. You both know that. You received the notification." Gloria stepped forward. When she spoke, her voice was the voice I remembered from 11 years ago, measured, but with something beneath it, a pressure, like a hand pressing down on something it wanted to hold underwater. "Sarah, I understand you've been given some information that must be confusing. Your father was not well in his final months. He wasn't himself. Whatever he signed, whatever someone convinced him to sign, it doesn't reflect his real wishes." Someone convinced him. She meant me. She was standing on my porch, implying I had manipulated a man I hadn't spoken to in a decade. "Gloria," I said, "I'm going to ask you both to leave. If you have something to communicate, your attorneys can contact mine." "You're making a mistake." Brent's voice had dropped. "You don't understand what you're dealing with here." Was that a threat? It sounded like a threat. It was constructed to sound like a warning from someone who knows more than you do, which is one of the oldest forms of intimidation. "I need you both to leave my property now," I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of how steady it was. "If you don't, I'm calling the police." "Sarah," Gloria began. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway for 15 seconds, listening. Then I heard Brent's voice, muffled through the door, something short and hard directed at his mother, and then footsteps on the porch, and then a car starting. I called Mark. He told me to document the visit. Time. What was said. That they had come unannounced to my home. He said this was actually useful to us. "Showing up at your residence to pressure you," he said, "is not the behavior of people who believe they have a solid legal case." I called the non-emergency police line and reported the visit. The officer took a report. He was matter-of-fact and efficient and told me to call immediately if they returned. That night, I checked that all my doors were locked 3 times. Lily came downstairs for dinner, and I watched her talk about her history project and her friend Jasmine's new dog, and I thought, she doesn't know any of this. She is sitting here eating pasta with her mother, and she has no idea that her grandfather left us more money than either of us can fully comprehend, or that 2 people just stood on our porch and tried to frighten me into giving it up. After she went to bed, I allowed myself to feel it. The fear, the loneliness of having no one to share this with who wasn't a professional, the grief, strange and delayed and complicated. For a father I had already been mourning in a different way for 11 years. I took 4 days off from the plan, not from life, not from teaching, but from the active work of fighting. I walked. I cooked. I called my sister in Philadelphia and talked about nothing in particular. I sat in the backyard on Saturday afternoon in February, cold, and drank coffee, and watched a crow investigate my neighbor's fence post. Then on Monday, I went back to work and called Mark and told him I was ready for whatever came next. The offer came through official channels, at least. I'll give Brent that much. He had retained his own attorney, a firm out of Scottsdale with an Ohio associate. And 12 days after showing up at my door, they submitted a formal settlement proposal through Mark's office. Mark called me on a Thursday evening to walk me through it. I was sitting in my car in the school parking lot, having stayed late to help a student with a reading assessment. The afternoon light was flat and gray, February doing its slow, grinding work on everyone's patience. "They're offering $10.4 million, Mark said, in exchange for a full release of all claims to the estate and a non-disparagement agreement." $10 million. I sat with that for a moment. $10 million was more money than I would earn in my entire teaching career, multiplied by a factor I didn't want to calculate. It was more than enough to pay off Lily's college, fix the kitchen ceiling, retire early, never check a bank balance anxiously again. "What do you think?" I asked. Honestly? A pause. I think they're scared. A $10.4 million offer when the total estate is $44 million tells me they don't believe they can win an outright challenge. They're trying to cut their losses. What are the grounds for a challenge? They'll argue testamentary incapacity, that your father lacked the mental clarity to amend his will when he did. Possibly undue influence, though that one's harder for them given that you hadn't been in contact with him for years. They'll need medical records suggesting cognitive decline. Did he have cognitive decline? That, Mark said, is exactly what we're going to find out. I've already requested his medical records through the estate. His primary physician's records arrive next week. But Sarah, my preliminary read, based on the notarization, the witnesses, and the clarity of the language in the amendment, is that your father knew exactly what he was doing. I thought about the handwritten note on the back page of the amendment. I know this cannot fix what was lost, but it is what I have left to give. That was not the writing of a man who didn't know what he was doing. That was the writing of a man who had lived with a decision for a long time and finally acted on it. No, I said. Tell them no. Mark was quiet for a moment. You're sure? I'm sure. He said he'd respond within 48 hours. I drove home in the gray February light and didn't think about it again that night. What I didn't anticipate was how lonely the certainty would feel. I was right. I knew I was right. But being right, when you're doing it alone, in a 2-bedroom house in Columbus with a yellowed kitchen ceiling and a 16-year-old who doesn't know why her mother sometimes goes quiet in the middle of dinner, has a particular texture. It's not dramatic. It's just heavy. I called Kim on a Friday night. She came over with Thai food and a bottle of white wine, and we sat at my kitchen table until nearly midnight. I told her everything. The offer, the refusal, the visit from Gloria and Brent, the note in my father's handwriting. She listened with the quality of attention that only very good friends provide, which is the kind that doesn't rush toward conclusions or advice, but simply stays with you in the middle of the difficult thing. Do you think he actually loved you? She asked at one point. Not cruelly, carefully. I thought about it. I think he did. I think he was also a coward. I think he loved me and was a coward at the same time, for a long time, and at the end he finally did the one thing he could do that was neither. Kim nodded. She refilled my glass. Then fight for it, she said. Not just for the money. Fight because he finally did the right thing, and those people spent 11 years making sure you two couldn't find each other, and they shouldn't get to profit from that. I hadn't thought of it quite that way before, but she was right. Gloria had been the distance between my father and me, not the only cause of it. I am not naive about my father's choices, but a significant architecture of it. She had written that certified letter in 2016. She had, I was beginning to understand, managed my father's relationships the way some people manage a household budget. Everything accounted for, everything controlled, nothing spent on things she deemed unnecessary, including me. Mark was more than my attorney at this point. He had become something I also needed, which was someone who believed in the legitimacy of my position, not as a friend, but as a professional. His confidence was not the soothing confidence of someone trying to make me feel better. It was the brisk, specific confidence of someone who had read the documents and made a judgment. "We're going to be fine," he told me the following Monday when I came in to sign some papers. "What they have is a theory. What we have is a document. 2 witnesses, a notary, and 11 years of your father keeping you deliberately out of his life, which actually works in our favor. You didn't have access to him. You didn't have the opportunity to influence him. If anyone had influence over Edward Collins in his final years, it was Gloria." He said that last sentence quietly, almost to himself. I left his office feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time in relation to this situation. Ready. She came alone this time. No Brent, no unannounced arrival. She had called that morning, which was worse in a way because it meant I had to decide whether to let her come. I called Mark. He said it was my choice, but that refusing to see her could be characterized later as inflexibility, whereas meeting with her on my own terms demonstrated confidence. "Just don't agree to anything," he said, "not even informally. And if she says anything that strikes you as significant, write it down the moment she leaves." Gloria arrived at 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon in March. I had made tea because it gave me something to do with my hands. Lily was at Jasmine's house. The kitchen still had its yellowed ceiling. I had not yet scheduled the repair. I still wasn't sure why. She sat across from me at my kitchen table and looked around the room with the same careful inventory as before. But this time she kept it off her face. She had decided, I understood, to come as something other than what she'd been on the porch. Today she was going to try compassion. "I know we got off on the wrong foot," she began, which was such a spectacular understatement for 11 years of silence and a certified letter that I almost said so. I didn't. I poured the tea. "I understand you're grieving," she continued. "We both are." Edward was. She paused. Her eyes filled with something that might have been genuine grief, and I was careful not to assume it wasn't. People who do harmful things can also feel real pain. The two are not mutually exclusive. "He was complicated. He always was. I think you know that." "I knew him differently than you did," I said. "We had different relationships with him." "We did." She wrapped her hands around the mug. "Sarah, I want you to know. I never wanted it to be this way. Between you and Edward, it broke his heart. Then why did you send a certified letter in 2016 telling me he didn't want contact?" A brief stillness. She had been expecting deflection, perhaps, or hurt, not a direct question. "He asked me to send it." "Did he?" "He was going through a very difficult time. His health had started." "If he asked you to send it," I said, "then it would have been in his handwriting, or he would have sent it himself. He knew my address." She looked at me. Something shifted in her face. The careful compassion adjusted itself, subtly, the way a person adjusts their grip on something that's slipping. "I'm trying to reach out to you," she said. "I'm trying to repair something." "I know you are," I said, "and I'm asking you to tell me what you actually want." The directness seemed to unsettle her. She had prepared for a different conversation. She had come in expecting, perhaps, a version of me that still wanted her approval, that still carried enough daughterly guilt about the estrangement to be moved by the suggestion that it had been mutual. She had not prepared for a version of me that had already read the documents, hired the attorney, refused the $10.4 million offer, and had 11 years to think about exactly what had happened and why. She tried a different approach. "Edward wasn't well," she said. "You have to understand that. In the last year, he wasn't the man you knew. He got confused. He got frightened. There were times when he said things that weren't." She stopped. "He didn't always know what he was signing." There it was, the incapacity argument delivered across my kitchen table over tea, before any court had asked for it. "That's a legal claim," I said. "If you believe it, your attorneys can make it." "I'm not talking about legal claims." Her voice had an edge now. "I'm talking about my husband. I am talking about a man I cared for 18 years, who was frightened and confused in his last months, and who may have been. She stopped again. I am telling you that what he signed does not reflect what he would have wanted if he had been himself. I looked at her across the table. Gloria, my father wrote a note in his own handwriting on the back page of that amendment. I have read it. I know what he said in it. I don't think it was written by someone who didn't know what he wanted. Her jaw tightened. What note? The one you clearly haven't read, which tells me he wrote it without telling you. The silence that followed was of a different quality than any we'd had before. It was the silence of someone recalculating. I think you should leave, I said, not unkindly, firmly. She stood. Her posture had changed entirely. The compassionate visitor was gone, and what replaced her was something harder and less practiced. You are making a very serious mistake, she said. I have resources. I have people who will testify to his state of mind. I have 18 years of documented marriage, and you have a decade of absence. Do not underestimate what we can do in court. I'll see you there, I said. I walked her to the door. I stood on the porch and watched her car until it turned the corner. Then I went inside, and I was afraid. There it was. Genuine fear. The kind that lives in the chest, the kind that knows the person who just walked out your door is not done. But the fear didn't drain me. It did something else. It clarified everything. It was like cold water on a hot day. Sudden and sharp, and underneath the shock, energizing. She had come to unmake me, and I had held. She had come with manipulation folded inside compassion, and I had seen every layer of it. I picked up my pen and wrote down everything she had said, word for word, as close as I could remember. Then I texted Mark. She came. I have notes. Call me Monday. The hearing was set for the 3rd week of April, Maricopa County Probate Court, Scottsdale, Arizona. I flew there on a Tuesday morning and took a taxi to a hotel that cost more per night than I'd ever spent on accommodation. And I told myself this was not extravagance but necessity. I needed to be rested. I needed to be present. Mark met me at the hotel that evening to go over everything one last time. He had prepared a binder, evidence, timeline, witness statements, medical records, tabbed and indexed with the specificity of someone who had done this many times and understood that judges respond to organization the way most people respond to good manners. The medical records had been, as he had expected, decisive. My father's physician of 11 years, a Dr. Peralta in Scottsdale, had documented his care thoroughly. Yes, my father had been diagnosed with early-stage heart disease in January of the year he died. Yes, he had experienced fatigue, some depression, some anxiety about his prognosis, but his cognitive assessments, conducted routinely as part of his cardiac care, showed no meaningful decline. His memory and reasoning scores in August, the month he amended his will, were entirely within normal range for a man his age. Dr. Peralta had agreed to testify, and his written statement was 9 pages long and left very little room for interpretation. The notary who had witnessed the amendment was a woman named Constance Bell. She had notarized documents professionally for 22 years. In her statement, she described my father as alert, clear in his communication, fully aware of the document he was signing, and specific about his intentions. She had not been called by Gloria's attorneys because she had not been paid by Gloria's attorneys. She had been called by mine. The 2 witnesses, a man named Gerald Park, who'd been my father's neighbor for 8 years, and a woman named Dorothy Sims, a former colleague of his from before his retirement, had both provided statements confirming that they had been present at my father's request, that he had explained the purpose of the amendment clearly to both of them, and that he had appeared, in Gerald Park's words, like a man who had made a decision he'd been sitting on for a while and was relieved to finally make it. We entered the courtroom on Wednesday morning. It was a smaller room than I had imagined, not the grand wood-paneled chambers of television courtrooms, but a workmanlike space with fluorescent light and the particular quiet of a room where consequential things happen without ceremony. I sat beside Mark at the petitioner's table. Across the room, Gloria and Brent sat with their attorneys. Gloria was wearing black. Brent's jaw was set in the way of a man who has been telling himself for months that something is impossible and is only now beginning to doubt that assessment. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Patricia Dempsey, somewhere in her late 50s, with an economy of expression that made it impossible to read what she was thinking. Gloria's attorneys went first. Their argument was composed and professional. They presented a narrative of a man in his final year of life, frightened by his diagnosis, emotionally vulnerable, potentially susceptible to external influence. They submitted a statement from a neighbor I didn't recognize, who claimed my father had seemed confused and forgetful in his last months. They implied, carefully, without stating it directly, that the amendment had been made under unusual circumstances that warranted scrutiny. Then Mark presented our case. Dr. Peralta's testimony took 40 minutes. He was precise, technical, and unshakable. Under cross-examination, Gloria's attorney attempted to get him to acknowledge that early cardiac disease might affect cognition. Dr. Peralta acknowledged that it could in some patients. He stated clearly that in Edward Collins' case, his documented assessments showed no such effect. Constance Bell testified for 20 minutes. She described the day of the signing in careful detail. She described my father's demeanor. She described a man who asked a question about the notarization process, who made a small joke, who thanked her when it was done. She described, when asked by Mark, whether she had any doubt that the man before her understood what he was signing. No, she said, none. Then Brent was called to testify by his own attorneys in support of their claim. This, I think, is where it came apart. He had been coached. You could tell. The answers in the beginning had the practice quality of things repeated until they sounded natural. But Mark's cross-examination was patient and specific. He asked Brent about specific dates, about specific conversations with his father, about when exactly he had first learned of the amendment. Brent said he had learned of it at the will reading. Mark produced phone records showing a call between Brent and Gloria's personal attorney 3 days before the will reading. The silence in the room changed quality. Brent said there must be some explanation. Mark asked him to provide one. Brent looked at his attorneys. His attorney objected. The judge allowed the question. Brent said the call had been about other matters. Mark asked what matters. Brent said he couldn't recall. The judge made a note. Her face was entirely neutral, but a judge making a note during cross-examination means something. Gloria testified last. She was composed at first. Composed in the practiced way she had always been composed, the way of a woman who has been performing competence for so long it has become indistinguishable from the real thing. But Mark pressed her on the certified letter of 2016. He asked whether my father had requested it. She said yes. He asked for any documentation of that request, a text, an email, a note, anything. She said it had been verbal. You have no written record, Mark confirmed, of your husband requesting that you send a certified letter to his daughter terminating contact? It was verbal, Gloria repeated. Was anyone else present for that verbal conversation? A pause. No. I watched her face during that exchange. For the first time since I had known her, across 2 decades of careful management, She looked something I had never seen her look before, uncertain. She had built 11 years of distance between my father and me on a story that only she could corroborate, and she was now being asked, in a court of law, to prove it. I folded my hands in my lap and sat very still. Judge Dempsey did not rule from the bench. She took 2 weeks, which Mark told me was normal, and which felt to me like 2 weeks of living inside a held breath. I flew back to Columbus, taught my 4th graders, ate dinner with Lily, walked to the coffee shop on Saturday mornings, and did not allow myself to speculate. Speculation, I had learned, was a room I should not spend too much time in. The ruling arrived on a Thursday. Mark called at 7:14 in the morning, which told me everything before he spoke. "Sarah, we won." I sat down on the edge of my bed. The judge had upheld the amendment. The will stood as executed. I was the primary beneficiary. The ruling was 12 pages thorough and addressed every argument they had made. Mark read me one passage in particular. The judge's observation that the 2016 letter had been a unilateral action taken without demonstrable authorization, the effect of which was to sever contact between Mr. Collins and his adult daughter during the years in question. She had not explicitly accused Gloria of anything. Courts are careful that way. But the language was precise, and it was now part of a public record. My father had not abandoned me. He had been managed away from me. A judge had put that into 12 pages that would exist long after any of us were gone. I would be lying if I said I didn't feel something profound in that moment. Not triumph, not even relief exactly. Something quieter, a settling. The kind that happens when you've been carrying the wrong version of a story for years. The story that you were left, that you were not worth the fight. And a document arrives that says, that is not what happened. Gloria and Brent filed an appeal within 2 weeks. Mark reviewed it and told me it was thin. They're going through the motions. No new evidence, no legal grounds they didn't already exhaust. The appeal was denied 4 months later without a hearing. The court ordered legal costs shared proportionally. Because Gloria and Brent had initiated the challenge and lost, their share was substantial. The final accounting was not small. Brent's call to the attorney before the will reading also had consequences. The Arizona State Bar opened an inquiry into that attorney's conduct, whether he had violated confidentiality by communicating with an interested party before the official reading. Mark kept me informed. It did not go well for the attorney. There was one more thing. During the probate proceedings, it emerged that Gloria had attempted, twice, to initiate wire transfers from my father's estate account in the weeks before the funds were legally moved to me. Both attempts had been flagged for probate verification. She had not succeeded, but the attempts were documented. Mark referred the documentation to the probate court. They referred it to the relevant financial regulators. I did not press for criminal charges. That was a deliberate choice. I had what I had come for. I had no interest in punishment beyond what the law determined necessary without my direction. The difference between justice and revenge is exactly the distance between those two positions, and I knew which side I wanted to be on. What I wanted was what my father had wanted to give me, not a victory over Gloria. The money, yes, but more than that, the acknowledgement, documented and final, that he had chosen me. That in the end, after 11 years of silence and managed distance, he had found the only way left to say, "You were mine, and I am sorry." The $44,127,493.18 was released from the protected account 6 weeks after the appeal was denied. I called Mark to say thank you. He said it had been his privilege. Then I sat in my kitchen under the yellowed ceiling and called the contractor. The first thing I fixed was the ceiling. I know that sounds small. People would expect something cinematic, a new house, a vacation, a transformation. But I had been looking at that yellowed rectangle of plaster for 2 years, and fixing it felt like the right first statement. 3 days, a contractor, clean white plaster. It meant I could act on things now, not someday, now. Lily was the most important thing I addressed. Late May, end of her junior year. I sat her down over coffee and told her everything. The bank, her grandfather, the will, Gloria and Brent, the hearing, the ruling. The note in her grandfather's handwriting. She listened very still. When I finished, she was quiet. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want you afraid until I knew it was going to be okay." "That's very you," she said. We talked for 3 hours. She asked about her grandfather honestly, including the complicated parts. She cried once, briefly. I held her hand. "Your college, graduate school, not a ceiling, a floor. Choose based on what you want, not what you can afford." "What else?" "A foundation. Families dealing with estate issues who can't afford attorneys. Because what happened to me happens to people all the time, and most of them just lose." I kept teaching through the end of the school year. What you do for money and what you do because it matters are not the same question. Lily enrolled at Michigan that fall, studied public policy, and is now finishing law school in family and estate law. She chose it herself. The Collins-Mitchell Family Legal Fund opened 18 months after the ruling. 6 attorneys, 114 cases in year 1, 280 in year 2. As for Gloria and Brent, civil penalties, professional consequences, the Scottsdale house sold. I didn't follow their story. I had my own to live. I moved to a house outside Columbus with a garden and a porch I use every morning. A dog named Franklin, enormous and gentle. Kim comes for dinner on Thursdays. Last autumn, I stood at my father's grave in Scottsdale for 20 minutes with nothing prepared. Just the dry Arizona warmth and the question of what it means to be chosen late. It's not the same as having them, but it's not nothing. I left yellow flowers, the color of something unfinished that was still trying. Then I flew home. What I learned: money is not power. Knowing what you're entitled to is power. Silence is not peace. It's just postponed conflict. And the people who try to intimidate you out of what is rightfully yours are usually afraid of exactly one thing: that you won't be. I wasn't. What would you have done in my place? If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it.